Welcome to week 2 of my guide to the best 100 albums of all time. Who have we got today? I told you I was going through the 100 alphabetically. I told you that this week's group would be heavier than ABBA, my first selection. I told you that, like ABBA, they were neither American nor British. I more or less told you, in fact, that they were AC/DC, or as they are called in their homeland of Australia, Aka Daka. Yes, AC/DC were formed in Sydney, Australia, by two brothers who were anxious to emulate their older brother, George Young. George Young had been in a 60s group, Easy Beats, who were big in Australia, but had just one worldwide hit, Friday on My Mind. The band, formed by his younger brothers, Angus and Malcolm, would become rather bigger worldwide superstars. By the time of the first album, which was released in 1975, High Voltage, the other members of the band were drummer Phil Rudd, bassist Cliff Williams, and the lead singer Ronald Scott. But nobody knew Ronald Scott as Ronald Scott. Ronald Scott was from Scotland originally and was nicknamed Bonnie Scotland. This became shortened to Bon Scott. Bon Scott had emigrated to Scotland, emigrated to Australia when he was only 6. Curiously, the Young brothers had also been born in Scotland, but they were slightly older when they emigrated. You might expect a Celtic influence in the AC/DC music. Not really. There is a hint of Scotland in the bagpipes you can hear in AC/DC's second single, though. It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. When they first came out, critics were a bit sniffy. Rolling Stone magazine described their first album as an all-time low for hard rock. They changed the tune considerably in later years, did Rolling Stone magazine. They were an immediate success in Australia, but they didn't break through internationally until 1979 with Highway to Hell. This was shortly after the punk rock era. I personally think they have a lot to thank punk rock for, because punk rock made it fashionable to have shorter songs, hard guitar riffs. Ironically, I'm certain that if I said this to AC/DC directly to their face, I'd get a punch on the nose. Their manager even said it wasn't possible to hold a conversation with AC/DC about punk without them getting totally pissed off. They hate punk rock, ironically. Highway to Hell, however, tragically, was Bon Scott's last album. Nonetheless, most of the tracks on my playlist are from the Bon Scott era, from probably earlier albums than Highway to Hell, though. Work had barely begun on the follow-up album in 1980 when he died of alcohol poisoning. As with almost every rock star death, there's a conspiracy theory. Of course, invariably, when rock stars die at young ages, it's, well, nearly always from alcohol poisoning or drug poisoning, and there's nearly always some drunken or stoned friend on the scene who didn't help them much. The conspiracy theories think this is deliberate, when reality is their drunk friends were just no help and were equally incoherent as the likes of Bon Scott were. Bon Scott fell asleep in his car. His mate was unable to move him from the car, and he left him in the car to sleep it off. When he returned the next morning, he was dead. I think he'd choked on his own vomit. tragedy for AC/DC. He was a great singer, but they got a very able replacement. Musically, you can barely tell the difference. They recruited Brian Johnson. He was known vaguely to the British audience because he'd been in a one-hit wonder of a glam rock band called Geordie. Check out their single "Because of You," which he used to sing in the football shirt of Malcolm McDonald, who was the top Newcastle United player of that era. Not much else changed musically, but they just became more successful. All AC/DC songs from 1975 through to present day have the same DNA. They don't do ballads. They don't take themselves too seriously normally. Live is a bit of an exception. They are a kick-ass live band in the main, but Angus Young does persist in doing, in the middle of Let There Be Rock, he does insist on doing an excruciatingly long, boring guitar solo. I've got Let There Be Rock on my playlist, but I've chosen the studio version from the 18-minute version I could have chosen on live at River Plate. But the album, the first album they did with Brian Johnson, was the third best selling album of all time by anybody. 50 million copies have been sold worldwide. The only two groups to have artists ever beaten them, Michael Jackson and the Eagles, neither of whom are feature in this book. So this AC/DC have the best selling album within this book. They've never quite matched the sales figures, but they do remain very successful. Their output has slowed. They just do albums every 4 or 5 years or so now. It will usually go to number one. They'll usually do a world tour of football stadia. They're still box office. For example, they didn't in 2007, although they hadn't released an album for 7 years, they still sold 1.3 million CDs in the USA. Excuse me. By 2009, they'd sold 71 million records in the USA, making them 10th in the all-time list for America. It's not been a whole lot of roses all the time, though. Sorry for that very poor pun. 2016 in particular was a terrible year for them. Phil Rudd was accused of conspiracy to murder, so he couldn't play with the band. Brian Johnson was given doctor's orders to stop touring because he was in danger of damaging his hearing irreparably. This all came on top of the 2014 retirement of Malcolm Young, who'd been forced to retire because dementia. Cliff Williams had left the band too. So for the 2016 tour, successful tour though it was, Angus Young was actually the only remaining member of the classic lineup. This made hardly a scrap of difference. They still sold out all the stadium and filled festivals. Part of this was because rock and roll became like football for a brief while, because they had a big money transfer. Stripped of their star singer, AC/DC borrowed the services of Axl Rose from Guns N' Roses. A controversial move, a brave move given Axl Rose's reputation for unreliability and turning up on stage very late. But actually, give him his credit, he did a brilliant job and he did turn up on stage on time. Don't know what happened there. Something of a miracle. It is, however, very much Angus Young's band. He's very much a band leader. His stranglehold on the band only enhanced by the fact that one of the replacement new members was another Young family member, Stevie Young, who was a nephew of Angus's. As I said, most of the songs I've chosen are from the Bon Scott era, but there are two from Back in Black, including the Back in Black itself, which has one of the classic riffs of all time, and one for those about to rock, We Salute You, a 1981 follow-up. I always get a bit puzzled. For those about to rock, We Salute You would be a superb way to start any live show. They always do it as an encore instead. Idiots. The latest track chosen, however, is Thunderstruck from one of their later albums, the otherwise unremarkable The Razor's Edge. Nonetheless, Thunderstruck is probably my favourite AC/DC track of all. So that's AC/DC for you. What can you expect next week? Who am I going to talk about next week? Well, it's another band who broke through in the late 70s, early 80s, similar time frame to AC/DC. Another band beginning with A. Is it a pin-up pop band? Is it a hardcore punk band? Or is it a bit of both? See you next week.